Chapter 28. The Moral Qualia. Why do you call me good? No one is good except the Father who is in heaven. Jesus. Drawing inspiration from the emerging field of quantum mechanics, Alfred North Whitehead made significant progress in grappling with the complex problem of consciousness. He proposed a fundamental reality characterized by a multi-leveled process that unfolds into possibilities. This conceptualization offered a slightly more satisfactory explanation for the emergence of qualia. Although Whitehead himself was not an idealist, his notion of processes aimed at realizing possibilities aligns with the nature of thinking. He argued that this process, occurring at the quantum level, operates independently of the mind. However, I find it difficult to conceive of a process as a substance any more than information. A process is typically quantifiable, but as previously discussed, measurement alone is an inadequate argument for materialism. Essentially, a process can be understood as information structured as an algorithm, an embodiment of thought. A thought process is still without material substance. The thought process that underlies consciousness is not fragmented. It is a continuous flow. Similar to the wave-like spread of particles and the limitations imposed by the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, consciousness eludes dissection. Instead, it unfolds as a stream of thoughts, continuously moving into the past while embracing potential future possibilities. We can only differentiate thoughts, as well as objects of reality, when we engage in recollection. The thoughts and things that constitute our existence reside continually in the past. The present moment encompasses only a fleeting slice of the recent past. Consciousness is a story, an unfolding narrative that presents possibilities for a conscious observer to recollect and comprehend the past. This perspective suggests that we exist within the confines of the past, bound to the story's trajectory. Similar to the pages of a written narrative, the universe chronicles our lives and experiences. We cannot escape our story or transcend it in any way beyond vain imagination. The measurement problem, in this context, arises from our consciousness perceiving the written story. And just as a story implies teleology, purpose, intention, anticipation, memory, and moral significance, these elements are inherent in our conscious experience. Yet, we can judge the story. We can access the goodness of history. Goodness may not immediately reveal itself because we are accustomed to viewing ourselves within a dualist or materialist framework where goodness is often approached from a utilitarian perspective. However, individuals naturally assess the quality of stories and other aspects of reality through their cognitive processes. We instinctively ask questions like, is this a good story? Or, is that a beautiful picture? The contemplation of quality and goodness finds its natural place within the idealist framework. The materialist and even dualist worldviews tend to seek externalized answers to these inquiries. In idealism, goodness is inseparable from the subjective nature of consciousness. It is an inherent aspect of mindful engagement. Reducing it to mere quantification would only diminish its true essence. In the movie Dead Poets Society, the English teacher John Keating significantly impacts his students by challenging the conventional approach to studying poetry. In one memorable scene, Keating asks the students to locate the introduction to poetry in their textbook. He encourages them to tear out those pages, symbolizing his rejection of the textbook's analytical and rigid approach to understanding and appreciating poetry. Keating's motive is to inspire the students to explore poetry on a deeper and more personal level, free from the constraints of academic formulas and measurements. The textbook's introduction, which reduces the enjoyment of poetry to a mere graph, is seen by Keating as a mechanical and soulless representation of the art form. He believes poetry's true essence lies in its personal and emotional impact on individuals. So, it is with goodness. The confined essence of goodness within consciousness should not be misconstrued as a mere product of subjective relativity. While goodness finds its roots within our individual consciousness, it also extends beyond the boundaries of our personal observations. There is a sense that goodness emanates from the very fabric of the story itself, transcending our perspectives and reflecting the author's character. Goodness is not a subjective imposition that we superimpose upon the larger narrative. Rather, it is a participatory element entwined with the essence of the story. It demands something from us, an active engagement. In essence, goodness is not solely a matter of qualia, but a call to action, a mandate to enhance the narrative and keep with the divine author's style. Put another way, goodness is God's artistic style seen in creation. By recognizing the significance of goodness as an intrinsic aspect of the story, we acknowledge that it is not a fleeting and arbitrary concept. It holds universal implications and requires our active participation in shaping the course of the narrative. In embracing this understanding, we are propelled to embrace our role as co-authors of the story, seeking to enhance its beauty, depth, and moral significance through our actions. Thus, goodness transcends individual subjectivity and becomes a shared responsibility, urging us to strive to improve the narrative and realize its inherent potential. Despite the likes of atheists Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, the materialist attempts to ground moral goodness in the materialist worldview is an abject failure. Their arguments consistently remain descriptive, lacking the ability to provide prescriptive moral principles. As a result, there is no compelling reason for them to adhere to ethical standards beyond their own subjective inclinations. It can be frustrating to witness their reluctance to acknowledge the clear implications that arise from the materialist worldview. Perhaps, deep down, they are aware that embracing moral nihilism would not further their mission of promoting atheism on a broader scale. Materialism leads logically to moral nihilism, as materialists lack a coherent basis for constructing an ethical system within their worldview. Their belief in a mindless and unguided universe undermines the possibility of deriving objective moral values from such processes. Descriptive standards devoid of personal obligation fail to provide a compelling reason for individuals to adhere to or respect impersonal prescriptions. Science, focused on understanding the natural world, is fundamentally distinct from the realm of morality, making it incapable of providing a comprehensive moral standard. Goodness transcends the scope of scientific inquiry, rendering it unsuitable for deriving moral values solely from scientific principles. The primary reason is that ethical thinking requires some form of obligation, a relational idea. In other words, we are never obligated to a what, only to a who. No one would say they have a moral obligation to speak politely of a rock or save a glass of water from consumption. So, obligation only makes sense to persons, not things. Morality is a relationship of subjects to subjects, rather than subjects to objects. Since there is no ultimate who for them, they are left morally bankrupt with the descriptive what. They can measure assumed good behaviors or ideas, but have no epistemological reason to justify their measurements. This is not to say that materialists cannot act morally. It is that they have no coherent reason to do so. Moreover, materialists cannot even define personhood, lest they let the mind concept ruin their atheism. A materialist cannot coherently answer why someone should do as they morally instruct. All their moral theories are, therefore, toothless. As I argue the materialist must be, the skeptical ethicist has four major options: relativism, subjectivism, emotivism, and moral nihilism. Moral relativism is the view that moral beliefs and actions are only valid as they are relative to others. Moral subjectivism is the ethical view that such ideas and actions are unique to the individual. Emotivism is the belief that righteous thoughts and actions are merely founded on people's intuitions and emotions. Finally, moral nihilism is the view that all moral claims are uncertain or essentially false. One can easily expose the inadequacy of these viewpoints by employing the well-known moral error argument. Materialism, which posits a closed system devoid of consciousness, is where only physical matter exists. Suppose a materialist wishes to criticize an alleged morally reprehensible statement like transgender women should be prohibited from using women's restrooms. If the moral relativist disagrees, their only recourse is to distance themselves, as all moral statements are deemed factual only within the context of a particular culture. If the moral subjectivist holds a different view, they can merely abstain from participating, since moral truth is subjective to the individual. They cannot assert that the person holding the opposing view is wrong. They can only state their lack of support for the imperative. If the person subscribes to moral emotivism and disagrees, any rational condemnation of the statement becomes untenable. According to moral emotivism, those who advocate excluding transgender women from women's restrooms are correct as long as others genuinely feel that way. Finally, appeals to moral nihilism are fruitless, as they posit the absence of any moral truths. Consequently, materialists can only denounce or object to an erroneous moral claim by invoking some transcendent principle. However, since they cannot do so within the confines of their materialistic worldview, they are left with the option of abandoning materialism or rejecting the legitimacy of any prescriptive moral claim. So materialists find themselves on the horns of many dilemmas to keep their metaphysical stance. For example, they must be atheists, hold to an illusionary view of mind, and now, it is argued, be moral skeptics. They cannot even admit to the reality of personhood, since the mind is an illusion. The term illusion presents a dilemma when applied to our conscious experience, implying an unreal or deceptive nature. When we examine our conscious experience, dismissing it as fake becomes challenging because it intuitively feels natural. We have an inherent awareness of our consciousness, making it difficult to perceive it as illusory. Descartes famously stated, "I think, therefore I am," emphasizing the undeniable existence of his conscious experience. He couldn't doubt it. Moreover, if we acknowledge an experience as an illusion and comprehend its nature, does that mean the subsequent experience of understanding is also illusory or somehow unreal? It seems logically self-defeating. Epiphenomenal is a better word than an illusion for these materialists. Some use it. Epiphenomenal means any experience that is a byproduct, such as smoke, always seen with running steam engines. The engine is the central experience, but the smoke is something epiphenomenal. It is an emergent experience. The argument is that the mind is an emergent experience from the brain. Setting aside the logical conclusion that this makes them dualists, the argument is self-defeating. If the mind is epiphenomenal, it cannot give feedback on the subject's experience. In other words, it cannot be self-referencing. Smoke is emergent from the steam engine, but the engine is not emergent from the smoke. Once it is emergent, it has no connection with the subject except its original association. If the mind is identical to the brain, then consciousness is necessarily an object-to-object affair. That is that scenario. Consciousness, however, is a subject-to-object situation by definition. Take the illusion metaphor once more. If a person knows that red in their consciousness is false, bearing no connection to reality but merely emergent, then that person is thinking about their perception, acting as a subject. Hence, they have perceived something about their perception, a self-referencing experience. In psychology, this is called metacognition. For consciousness to be called consciousness, there must always be a subject. If the agnostics can be conscious of their consciousness, they perceive their own thoughts and experiences. If the brain is identical to consciousness, how can it perceive itself without another brain? Can a mirror reflect itself? Some will argue that lower levels of awareness contradict this understanding. Some animals, for example, are not self-aware but conscious of the world around them. So why must consciousness necessarily be self-referencing? Consciousness includes awareness. So, while some minds may be limited in their understanding, awareness must consist of the possibility of self-awareness, like logic must have the possibility of paradoxes. Regardless, all limited minds, that we are aware of, are still self-referencing due to instincts and goal-oriented action. Their minds guide them towards self-referencing needs at a minimum. Nonetheless, assuming the epiphonema approach, you must believe there is no mindful reason to do anything. If any mental source of the behavior is false because it is a mere byproduct, it cannot be self-referencing. Accepting this point of view is also self-referencing because choosing this theory is an action sourced by the mental and therefore is false. Now, let us return to the materialist meta-ethical dilemmas. The universe is indeterminate, yet people do not have free will. Agency is a result of mind. Humans are worthless specks of dust on a backwater galaxy with no purpose or meaning. So, since human life is insignificant, even if they could muster up some materialist ethical theory, it would not matter a billion years after humanity has extinguished itself. In an interview with Ken Campbell, 1995, Stephen Hawking said, "The human race is just a chemical scum on a moderate-sized planet, orbiting around a very average star in the outer suburb of one among 100 billion galaxies. We are so insignificant that I can't believe the whole universe exists for our benefit. That would be like saying that you would disappear if I closed my eyes." How can a group of people who view humanity with such contempt hold any coherent ethical system that posits infinite value for human life? I argue that they cannot. Yet, I will assume I am wrong, and imagine these types believe in objective morality. How would those theories fare within a materialist framework? Their lack of positing some idea of obligation is problematic. If the materialist holds to the utilitarian approach, where actions are governed by the best good for the most people, the question is, upon what ground? Doing what is best for most people is itself a moral prescription. Since they are materialists, the grounds of moral principles are not in any thought or abstract principle, since there are no natural minds. At the very least, the materialist must connect objective moral action to amoral physical laws. If the materialist, for example, objects that her grounding is in reason and logic, they are begging the question. Reason and logic are the common currency for all moral language. It is not the mere use of such that grounds moral belief, but the validity of that logic. Besides, why must a person be reasonable anyway? On the contrary, any objective ethical statement must have some accountability to people within a particular context. Who is the final arbiter of a story? Is it not the author? Are the tale's characters obliged to the writer who breathed life into them? Moral consciousness is the awareness that something of ultimate good exists and that conformity to that goodness is both desirable and necessary. This shared consciousness is why the ardent agnostic physicist or nihilistic social science professor will appeal to fairness, equity, and tolerance if offended. They intuitively appreciate the differences between good and evil, even while denying any foundation for what they apprehend. People of good faith disagree about specific instances of moral action and belief because moral consciousness is qualia, and perspectives and interpretations vary. Few people will argue that people disagree, but disagreement is not evidence for moral relativism. It is evident that people know there is an ultimate good, but cannot seem to reach it. C.S. Lewis wrote, "Nature has all the air of a good thing spoiled." Moral consciousness, as presented, serves as the foundation for the well-known moral argument supporting the existence of God. By highlighting the clear distinction and indispensability of a conscious mind concerning reality, one can grasp the moral imperative for God's existence. Only God possesses the authority to determine what is written on the pages of the grand narrative. Although the overarching story allows for interactive characters with free will, they may choose to either love the author or mistakenly attempt to write their own stories, disregarding their inherent connection to the larger narrative. However, such attempts are futile and illusory. We find ourselves bound within the universal story, constantly residing in the past. The present moment merely encompasses the anticipation of possibilities wherein we have the freedom to make choices. Nonetheless, we must accept our existence as beings limited by time and space, inherently tied to the unfolding story. Thus, transcending the narrative is impossible unless God authors a sequel. According to the Christian faith, this is what has occurred. Faithful characters will be translated into a new story tailored explicitly for them, resulting in an even more extraordinary tale. All the preceding arguments lead us to the moral argument for the existence of God, which states that if objective moral values exist, then God must exist. Our earlier discussions demonstrated that a world devoid of consciousness could not exist, as it is a contingent possibility within a more extensive set of possible worlds where a necessary mind must exist. As necessary aspects supersede contingent possibilities, we can conclude that God exists. Furthermore, if God exists, he must embody the most excellent form of goodness. Our perception of God naturally includes a moral consciousness. Yet, our own moral inadequacies indicate an inherent desire for moral completeness, compelling us to seek and strive for the highest form of goodness. Like the objectivity of red, we perceive goodness, but struggle to fully describe it without a corresponding concept to embody it, just as the idea of an apple incorporates the color red. If there were no instances of red in the world, we would not have the experience of seeing red. Similarly, if there were no good God, we would be devoid of the knowledge of ultimate goodness. I have alluded to the idea that consciousness commands the creative process of reality. If idealism is correct, then logic, reason, and even mathematics are all normative in that sense of instructing perception. The first example of this idea was revealed with the first command, "Let there be light." Reason is normative because it tells the consciousness what to do. It invites us to believe and act. If I have 2 laying hens in the chicken coop, I should acknowledge that at least 2 eggs are probably awaiting me. If I paid for a 50-cent piece of gum from a candy store with $1, I should expect 50 cents in change. I should believe that the square root of 2 is an irrational number. If my car tire goes flat, I should change it if I want to travel. Reduction leads us to quantum mechanics, where these normative parameters most literally instruct the objects of our perception. The artist decides the outcome of art. Reason, logic, and math are but our inferences into how God thinks, just as art connoisseurs can distinguish between the styles of Monet and Bob Ross. Moreover, since we are bound to that work of art, being creatures of history, we are subject to the normativism of the story as it generates into the future. The artist's style governs us. We have no alternative to rationality except to reject its instructions and live foolishly. The formulation, or discovery, of these ontological laws is a summary of the prescriptions and intentions of the higher storyteller. Causation only means how a mind causes a dream or how a writer invents a plot. Cause and effect are the strokes of the paintbrush or the syllables of a word. If physicists are grateful for consistent natural laws from which to judge the history of the universe or eke out practical applications, they should thank the disciplined mind of God. Miracles are not contradicted by the laws of nature for the idealist, since the laws of nature are but thoughts, and God can think whatever he wishes. The so-called laws of nature are the consistent and disciplined thoughts of the lawgiver, such that all phenomena are mind, and the rationality of the universe reflects that mind. Therefore, these laws of nature are the rules of not creation, but creativity, for our world is a work of provident imagination. Reality is his decision. If we have any choice, it will mean that he has built some indeterminacy into his story for us. This indeterminacy is precisely our situation. So, we come full circle to moral consciousness. If we have some room for creativity, it shows how we mirror the artist, as imago Dei. Yet it also enlightens us to take responsibility. The movement from cause to agency is personal. The question, why is water boiling in the kettle, misses the point if we say, because the heat energy on the stove burner excites the water molecules. Instead, the water boiling in the kettle lets me have my morning coffee. Moral consciousness knows we have the agency to imagine and create beauty or ugliness, and knowing we are in another story establishes the perception of objective morality for us. We cannot reach it because it is personal. It inhabits the goodness of God. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the tree of moral consciousness. When we eat it, we become self-conscious. Seeing our nakedness before ultimate goodness, we hide. When we write a story consistent with the grand narrative, we contribute to its beauty and meaning, but if we create counter-narratives, we ugly the story. We graffiti the art. Therefore, how we treat each other and relate to the artist is very important. The greater the story, the greater the offense when we blacken it with our misuse of freedom. When we are innocent, the artist bears responsibility. But when we decide to create, we also take on the iniquity of our creation. The only difference is that we cannot bear its weight. The materialist paints a much different picture of responsibility. For them, responsibility has no overarching schema. Everyone is one of many causes in a flood of mindless, unguided processes. Carried away by the flow of nature, they bear little or no responsibility for anything. They do not have any reason for justice or grace. They do not see the flow of creation as normative. It is unguided and the result of probability alone. You will hear them protest if you argue this point, but they cannot unfetter themselves from it. The problem of evil is even more of a problem for them because they cannot philosophically even define it if they are honest. They live in a state of denial about their eating habits in the garden of God. Many even deny humans have free will, as some will choose to point out. Why is there evil if there is a good God? They object, preferring to live with their dark nihilism instead. The standard of what makes an excellent divine story is found in the goodness of God himself. How stupid of the story's characters to judge the author. What a mess you wrote us into. Having never created a grand account themselves, only imitations, are we so presumptuous to judge the author of the only book we have ever known? Such critics are like the fallen critic who, not initially depicted in the new story, thought he could rewrite the story. If the story fails to reflect the artist has failed. If an eternal artist fails, the artist is not worthy of his art. The jealous critic knows if he can vandalize the images, God will forever have failed. We can safely assume that God cannot allow his art to be marred by his critics. In the end, the story will be a good one. It is not flippant to answer those who polemically ask why evil exists with, "It will make a good story."